Good evening and welcome. I'm going to give just another 30 seconds for people to trickle in. I'm going to go ahead and get started slowly but surely. My name is Tal Kitron with Applerouth Tutoring Services. We're going to talk today about the ACT, which is coming up for a lot of you or your students this Saturday, June 10th. You should notice that closed captioning is enabled, but you can also click out of that. We're going to have a short quiz and a question and answer session at the end. I don't anticipate this taking the full hour, but we'll definitely be out within the hour. And if you do have questions, just feel free to put them in the Q&A and I'll make sure that I get to those at the end. I've been with Applerouth for about 10 years. Great company. Our cornerstones are academic tutoring, so in school, and then test prep, so like what we're here for today, and I do a lot of ACT, SAT, and PSAT prep, and then executive function coaching, which is relatively new, but more helping students how to learn how to think, or about the way that they think and plan and prioritize and organize. So kind of a newish thing that we're doing that's actually very, very cool that I've started doing recently. What we're going to cover today is the format of the ACT, all 4 sections plus the experimental 5th section, which does not count. We'll talk through major strategies and open that up for questions, look at some practice problems on each section. And at the end, just look a little bit at timeline and how this all fits in with college apps. Whether you're a rising junior or senior next year, have some information about that. So first, here's how the ACT is scored. Unlike the SAT, which is out of 1,600, it's out of a possible 36 points. That's 4 sections, each of which you can get up to 36. All 4 sections are averaged to get a composite score, which is your ACT score, and it's always rounded up. So if you average out to a 32.5, that's a 33. But if it's 32.25, that's below the half mark, that rounds down to a 32. So 32.5 and up would be scored as a 33 on the ACT. We'll talk about taking the test more than once, how that helps people reach full potential, but also how super scoring can really impact the end composite score you put on college apps. So we'll get to that a little bit later. This is what the test always looks like. We start with the English section, and this is for those who don't have extended time, right? So if we just have regular time, first section is pretty fast paced. It's 45 minutes for 75 questions, 4 multiple choice answers per question, 5 passages with 15 questions apiece, and we'll dig into each of these sections a bit more. Next, you get math, which is 60 questions in 60 minutes, and really tough. They want you to know a little bit about a lot of stuff. Then the 1 break, so 10 minutes between those first 2 and the second 2. And these last 2 sections are huge time crunch sections. Reading and science are really, really fast paced, 40 questions in 35 minutes. So that's really hard for people to get to everything. And that's true for most of the ACT, honestly. Last few math questions are often tough and hard to get to. Reading, many students can't get to all 4 passages, so some have to prioritize 3 and then guess on 1 passage. And that's okay, we'll talk about that. And then for science, which is more about data analysis and interpretation, it's all about being efficient and using the answer choices and the graphs to full advantage. So again, without extended time, it's about a 3-hour time commitment. Practice tests are about the same, and those are really good ways to just prepare and have a resource for yourself in a tutor or peer review, because a mock test is the single best way to learn, right? As long as you're making the best use of it and going through questions that you missed the first time through. If you were thinking about this in comparison to SAT, one big difference, I mean, they're both about 3 hours, but the SAT has so many fewer questions So there's much more time per question. ACT is really a big rush. So what's on this test? Ton of overlap with the SAT. So a lot of Common Core stuff, English, grammar, and rhetoric. So punctuation, possession, clauses, pronouns, all sorts of stuff. High school math, and in ACT it includes a lot. So arithmetic, which are some of the hardest questions, just because we haven't thought about like absolute value or percents or inequalities in forever. A lot of algebra, a lot of geometry, and then some trig. There's also within the math section in science some data analysis and stats. And then you'll see, of course, reading comprehension on all 4 sections, but especially the third one, reading, and vocab. Vocab is much less heavily tested than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. So we still have some, but it usually strays towards fairly simple vocabulary. I don't think like flashcards are kind of in the days of the past. So before we get into each individual section, let's talk overall strategy. One of the biggest things you got to do is just understand the timing. Just develop your internal clock, even if it's just sitting there with your phone on the stopwatch function and hitting the lap button after each passage or each question, right? You really want to make sure, where am I losing time? Is it realistic to get to everything? What should I strategically be skipping? A lot of students don't consider that. First rule is you have to make sure you know what you're solving for. A lot of people go wrong just because they missed a word in the question or choices or passage. Second rule is keep it simple, because there's almost always a simple method of solution. So people try to work too hard on math in particular. Usually it's a lot simpler than we think. There's a basic step to get there. And then again, unlike in the past, there's no penalty for wrong answers. So don't leave anything blank. You might want to skip around, which means just bubble in like your answer of the day, meaning if you know you're going to skip some questions, make sure you pick the same answer for each one you skip. So for math, I always say pick E or K, which is the 5th answer choice. Any question that I don't get to right at the very end, the last 50, 54 through 60, and then maybe a few questions in the 30s and 40s that I didn't like and had to skip, I'll just put E and K in, because then I'm likely to at least get some of those right. I won't get them all, but it's better than Christmas treeing it and doing a lot of different letters. So that's just a good test taking strategy. Bubble in straight down the line for anything you don't get to. Leave nothing blank, bubble in straight down the line for anything you don't get to. It's very important. And honestly, that can make the difference between a 27 and a 30 on the ACT. Just if someone finishes and doesn't answer versus they guess at the end. So first up, let's talk English, which is section 1. Number one thing is we got to differentiate between grammar questions and rhetoric, which is actually pretty easy to do. Grammar questions will have a no change option. Rhetoric questions will have a question. There'll be some sort of job to do. Again, we get 75 questions, 45 minutes, which averages to just over 35 seconds per question, but some of them are going to be really, really quick, and some will take more like a minute. I would say most of my students don't have too much of a time issue on this section on English. Part of the reason is a lot of it's pretty simple. We're not really reading the passages. So here you would have a question or a passage on the left, question on the right. Let's note that A is no change, which is correct 1/4 of the time. So don't resist picking no change. Sometimes that's fine. And the trick here is, well, all these answers have verbs. ING verbs are problematic. So one thing I'll do in a session is kind of ask, hey, do you know why ING verbs aren't the best? Usually it's, no, not really. Well, so what is the verb writing? Like what tense is that? The answer is usually present tense. And it could be, right? If I said she is writing, but what if I said she was writing, right? Or will be, they will be writing. That's could be present, could be past, could be future. And if I just said she writing, I writing, right? Without the helper verb, it should sound bad. ING verbs aren't real verbs. They're not present tense, they're progressive. And what that means is on this test, they're often wrong. Not always, but it's a big red flag if you see ing verbs because they usually cause sentence fragments. Here, if we become SAT experts, you would notice A and C as both present tense verbs. One is singular, one is plural. And in my experience, what that means is three things. Number one, this is almost definitely a subject-verb agreement question, just based on those answer choices existing on this question. Right, so think like the test writers, why they put those there. Number two, almost always one of those is right. Seriously, almost always. And third, usually the subject's way before the verb. In this case, it's a bit of a funky one. The verb is actually before the subject, which is very strange. While it is weird to say mountaintops glides, C is correct because it is the eagle that glides. It glides, singular. So that can be tough because if you sound it out, it doesn't sound terrible at first. But you got to think about, oh, this is subject verb, and then knowing that, you'll be able to identify the subject and match. That's a grammar question. And here's a couple others. I'm just going to leave this up for a moment for people to look at, and then we'll talk through them. What's interesting here is a lot of students are tempted to read the passage, but for all these grammar questions, we don't really need to. So just look at what's changing between A, B, C, and D. And this looks exactly like what we're going to see on test day. So let's start with number one. My process on one would be, all right, it's punctuation. I see a semicolon, B has a comma, C has no punctuation, and then D's got a colon, the two dots. So first and easiest is going to be A, the semicolon, because on this test, semicolons are periods. So there's a rule. There's a slight difference in real life, but on the SAT and ACT, semicolons are periods, no exception, which means there must be an independent clause before and after, meaning full sentence before, full sentence after. In this case, first sentence is, in 1995, divers off the coast of Japan discovered a surprise on the seafloor. That's good. Got a subject, got a verb, that can stand alone. But then wait, circular patterns made of sand, something's missing. What about them? A is wrong because this clause is a dependent clause, and so the semicolon is improper. Next, I would test C, which has no punctuation, and that's often correct. So if I just take away that colon, it feels weird. They discovered a surprise on the seafloor, circular patterns made of sand. That should sound bad. We need some sort of pause. So that one's also not correct. Process of elimination in full effect. Then we compare B and D. Two dots is a colon. That's the drum roll, please, is how you should think of it. It is not just for lists. It just must follow a full sentence and introduce something. They discovered a surprise on the seafloor. Drum roll, please. What was that surprise? Oh, circular patterns made of sand. So that's why that one's D. Number two looks like it's just testing commas. So the one we want to look at first, if there is one, is the answer with no commas. So let's take a look at choice B, sound that out. Of course, on the test, we can't speak out loud, but you can kind of mutter it. You can say it in your head. If I write it with no pauses, it would be these circles were often over 7 feet in diameter and contain concentric rings and ridges, making them appear much like a target or landing pad, which wasn't horrendous. And honestly, usually when in doubt, we should cut commas out. But I felt like maybe this pause was okay. Pausing between concentric rings and ridges is weird. That's all one idea. Contains, well, I think we're in the past tense, so D doesn't really make sense. So down to A and B, and we'd have to just consider, can I get away with no comma? In this case, no, we need the comma. And then third one here is, again, punctuation. I notice a dash. When you see that, you should look for a second one. If it's there, then this is correct, and there's just 2 dashes. If it's only 1 dash, that's not necessarily wrong. So not to get into it too deeply, but 1 dash is a lot like a colon. It just has to come after a full sentence. The nice thing with number 3 is that B and D are identical. Semicolon and period we said are the same, so we can just cross those out. They can't both be right, so they're both wrong. And then in this case, because we've got a comma starting off this clause, not a dash, these patterns are short-lived as currents gradually erode them away. So there's another comma here. And we could test choice C, because if that's right, that's a comma clause or a positive that should be able to come out of the sentence. The divers were baffled by the discovery, and although these patterns are short-lived, the circles would periodically reappear around the region. Sounds fine. So that's obviously a pretty extensive look at these 3, but once you see a bunch of them, you'll see patterns, and you'll be able to quickly get down to 2 answers, and then usually just the best one. Okay, we were right. The other flip side of English, first section, is rhetoric. So about 40% or so of the questions, which means maybe like 35-ish of 75, are going to be rhetorical skills. And this is completely different. So don't forget everything we just said, but ignore it for these questions. There's no change answer. We've got some sort of job to do. We would only add a sentence as they're proposing here if it stays on topic and it flows smoothly. And when you see these 2 answers on English, you want to focus on the yes part and the no part. So we would read this sentence into the passage. We would decide, yeah, that's on topic. It fits in well. Or, ooh, no, it's better without. Here's an example of a rhetorical skills question that we can try. If we're talking about perfect strategy here, or not perfect, but good test-taking process, we're looking to accomplish a task, which is provide specific information about the writer's brother's hobbies. The rest is all boilerplate language that will be repeated verbatim. Given that all the choices are true, which one best accomplishes, don't focus on that part. Our job is specific information about hobbies. This is a rhetoric question, so we are robots. A, well, things I find boring or games I like, that's not that specific. I don't know. B, slam dunk correct answer. Legos, Lincoln Log, those are specific hobbies. C, not as specific. D, not as specific. So we can feel incredibly sure that B is the correct answer, which is what's nice about rhetoric, almost mathematically precise if we're on task and just accomplishing it robotically. So grammar, trust your ear, know the rules. Rhetoric, be a robot and match words and never work too hard. Obviously, that's not a good life lesson, but for ACT, we're looking for shortcuts. So final tips that I wrote up, grammar is all about short answers are better. So if you see an option to delete, D delete, it is often correct, right? D delete is often correct. Trust your ear. If it sounds wrong, it probably is. And then on the other side, rhetoric, the ones that actually ask you questions, just slow down and say, okay, I've got a job to do. Let's look in there and see what the writers of the test were trying to get me to see. What we want to make sure of is if we're going to add a sentence, it transitions, it stays on topic, right? And if we're accomplishing a task, we just want to make sure we stay true to what the writers are asking us to do. My advice on English, especially for high scorers, is treasure every question as if it's worth 1 point, because honestly, it probably is. So like you miss a couple of questions out of the 75, your score will drop from like a 36 to a 34, right? And it's not every question, but pretty much 1 or 2 questions, you'll drop a point. That's tough. It's graded on a curve, but it's because a lot of the 75 questions, if you know your rules, will be simple, and there'll just be a few that are a challenge. So that's section 1, would be 45 minutes in, and then we start with math. Math is 60 questions in 60 minutes, which is kind of rough. They like to test geometry and trig, but will not give you the formulas at the beginning of the section like the SAT does. But unlike the SAT, there's no calculator section. You're allowed the calculator for the whole time. There are also, the other difference is there are 5 answer choices. This is the only section on either test that has 5 choices, kind of annoying. The SAT is know a lot about a little, algebra. The ACT is know a little bit about a lot. Even just here, a cross section of questions 40 through 42, we see a logic question, we see geometry with a weird Utah looking shape, and then we see inequalities in the word not. So that's all in one test, and you cover like a lot of ground just with a few questions. The general rule is it goes from easy to hard. So I think there's overlap. Don't take this as gospel, but the rule of thumb is 1 through 20 are easy, 21 through 40 are medium, and 41 through 60 are hard. But if you just took calculus or pre-calc, maybe 41 through 60 has got a bunch of that, or unit circle when you just did that, versus number 20, which is geometry that you haven't done since freshman year. So you might want to skip around, prioritize easy points. The general rule is, though, the hard stuff will be at the end. Not many people get to the very end. We've got almost half algebra, and then almost half geometry and arithmetic, and then a smattering of trig and some other stuff. So strategy for this section, probably every math teacher ever has told you to show your work. I will also add circle what you're solving for. See, a lot of people go wrong because they solve for y and forget to plug back in for x. Or solve for x, didn't realize that we needed 3x. So circle what you're solving for, maybe even write it down in the margins. Always translate word problems into mathematical equations. So that means translate words into math whenever you can. Sometimes it's tough, but there's a lot of wordy problems that people get overwhelmed by. And if you create mathematical equations or just making numbers instead of words, it becomes more real, less abstract. Again, show your work, but also use the calculator. You can use a TI-83 or 84 or even TI Inspire as long as it doesn't have the CAS at the end. And so like you can graph stuff, you can do matrices and logarithms and combinations and convert decimals to fractions. So make sure that you know how to make full use of your calculator. Make sure it's charged. And then check your answer. This is kind of an iffy one. We might not have time. So when appropriate, sure, check your answer, make sure it's logical, but often we just have to move to the next thing. So check your answer if you have time. Just taking a look at a couple other math problems. Question on number 29 is, what is the tangent of A? So if a student has recently reviewed SOHCAHTOA and understands that acronym or mnemonic device and knows that tangent means take that angle and find the opposite over the adjacent, this question's not going to be too bad. The trick is, for me, I remember like when I took this back in the day, SOHCAHTOA was a thing that was hard for me. So it was one of the first things I wrote down. As soon as I got into the test, I just wrote it down on my booklet. But knowing that like see a root 3, that probably means we're dealing with the 30, 60, 90 triangle. We got to know Pythagorean theorem, area versus circumference. So a light review can make a big difference, just so you remember those things that you probably haven't thought about in years. And then for 30, we've got some vocab there. So like, what is an irrational number? Well, rational means it could be formed as an integer over an integer. So a whole number over another whole number. Irrational is stuff like pi or root 3, imperfect squares. For this question, we could immediately cross out F and J because 4 is rational And then 2 root 4 is just the same as 2 times 2. From there, because it's absolute value, I would just plug in the answers. So I wouldn't do any math, make it simple whenever you can. And let's just see, hey, does 2 root 2 work? Let's work that out. Absolute value of parentheses 2 root 2 parentheses squared minus 24 minus 8. 2 root 2 squared is 2 squared times root 2 squared. So that's 8 minus 24. So that's not the answer. Then we try again with choice H, which is 4 root 2. 4 root 2 squared is 4 squared, which is 16 times 2, which is 32. The absolute value of 32 minus 24 is 8, because the absolute value of 8 equals 8. So even if we didn't remember everything about those rules and what the brackets do, you could probably plug in, use the answers, pick numbers, right? Make it easy on yourself. If you're stuck, you're not always really stuck on this test. Here's another kind of classic example where students are really going to be tempted to use trig, but we don't want to do that. If you see a right triangle, which we certainly have here, and it doesn't mention like a square root of 3 or root 2 or 30, 60, 90, or we don't have an indication that we're dealing with that, we're just going to be doing Pythagoras, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Here, the key is just putting c on the right side of the equation, right? So it doesn't matter which one 24 is, could be a, could be b, it's a leg. So 24 squared plus wall squared equals 26 squared, and then just punch it into the calculator. Don't do any mental math. We are awarded no points for that. B squared is 100, so b is 10 or negative 10, although negative 10 doesn't really make any sense here. Our answer is J. The last thing is I just check and see if that's logical, but all the answers are pretty similar. 2 doesn't quite make sense. This is indeed a multiple of the 5, 12, 13, which is not something you have to memorize, because you can always use Pythagoras to get there. Little tricks like that can be helpful if you're aiming for a super high math score, because if you don't do shortcuts and tricks, it's hard to get to all 60 questions, especially with confidence. Here's another math example. So a couple of things to note here. One is that probability pretty much always has to do with finding the denominator first. So always think, what are we picking out of? Second thing is the answer choices here look very usable. So if I wanted to start, I'd start with C. You should always start in the middle, because then you'll know usually whether you need to go up or down. So you'll kill 3 birds with 1 stone. And then finally, because this is changing probability, the mathy way to do it, which I wouldn't expect a lot of my students to know, is let's focus on what is not changing. So we've got delicious macadamias and cashews and peanuts, and all we're adding is cashews. So if at the end, the probability of cashews has to be 2/5, probability of not drawing a cashew, AKA drawing a macadamia or a peanut, is 3/5. 18 peanuts plus 9 macadamias is 27. This is a classic thing that people do in ACT math, which is set up a proportion. 27 out of what final total will be 3 out of 5. Again, that 3/5 is just what's left when it's 2/5 cashews at the end. And then when a fraction equals a fraction, we cross multiply. 135 equals 3x, divide both sides by 3, x is 45, and then just double check that's what we were solving for. It's not. They said we need to get 45 at the end, but we're supposed to figure out how many cashews to add. So we started with what? A total of 40. 45 minus 40 equals 5. B is our answer. Not the only way to solve that, but that's the most mathy way. Last bit of information on math. So again, show your work Don't do mental math. Use your calculator. Prioritize easier questions, even if it means jumping around a little bit. And it's fine if you don't get to everything, but don't leave anything blank. I would say if you're taking the test this Saturday and felt like totally lost with some of the geometry and trig, just go back and look at really basic stuff. Area of a triangle, circumference versus area of a circle, like nothing too major. If they don't give you a picture, you should draw it. Didn't have opportunity to do that. And then if you're stuck, so most questions will be something simple, but if we don't have a simple step, then see if maybe the answers are usable, or we can plug in our own numbers, substitute those. Big thing there is just not many people get to everything. So prioritize the ones you can get to. It's better to nail 40 questions and guess on 20 than it is to be shaky on like 30 questions. It's also better to miss a question in 10 seconds than it is to get it right in 3 minutes, which is really hard to digest. But it's such a fast-paced test that that's the reality. Section 3, and often where mental fatigue starts to set in and students start to lose focus, especially with extended time, at that point you've been there already for a couple hours. But the deal here is we get a 10-minute break and then it's, all right, 40 questions, 35 minutes, time starts now, and you really gotta go. Some people have the idea to read the questions first. I don't think that works for most people. Everyone's different, but vast majority of students I've worked with over the years benefit from reading first and then doing questions. Here are just kind of some rules. So if we're trying to get to all 4 passages and we're just doing standard time, you get 8 minutes, 45 seconds per passage. That means reading probably 7, 8 paragraphs and doing 10 questions. You get under 9 minutes for that. That's a lot less than SAT, but it's usually simpler. Then some people are just going to realize I can't get to all 4. I always find myself running out of time. It's honestly at least half of my students. So maybe the better idea would be, let's focus on doing 3 passages, and then I'll just guess DJ, 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 DJ straight down for the one I don't get to. Not going to sweat it, but I'm going to nail these 30 questions that I do. Right? And then if your score is a little bit lower, we're like, starting at a 16, 17, 18, we can actually improve the score just by only focusing on 2 passages and guessing on 2. So this is something that's hard for people to, I guess, embrace, skipping questions, skipping passages, not getting to everything. But honestly, it's on a curve. And if you recognize that and prioritize easy passages and points, you'll be ahead of the game. So here's what we're looking at on reading. First is always literature or prose fiction. Characters, emotions, relationships, more of a story. Second passage is always social science. Third is always humanities. And fourth is always natural science. Knowing that that's the order can be helpful just in case you realize, man, I always get hung up on literature. Maybe I shouldn't start with that one. Right? So some people really need to bounce around or save their hardest passage for last. And essentially, I mean, really not essentially, this is an open book test. You've got passage that you read and you've got your questions, but you can always refer back, and you should be doing that. So goal on a science passage, so like passage 4 of reading, natural science, like this one, would be get through the passage pretty quickly. And then that will give you a lot more time to go back and forth. Ideally, we kind of have found where things are and taken little notes. But the correct answers will be perfect matches more often than not. What I would say would be my strategy for a typical ACT reading question is first actively read the question. So obviously first we read the passage, but actively read the question, and then, which means underline, circle what you're solving for. Second is, if we can, predict the answer. Sometimes that's impossible. Third is going to be match evidence to the passage. And honestly, maybe before I do that one, let's make that fourth. Before I do that one, I think the most important thing is going to be eliminate bad answers. This would be one of the first things I would do in a session, is talk about what are throwaway words, which are words the test writers have put in intentionally to make it wrong. If I write an ACT, I'm going to write a question and a correct answer, and then 3 choices aimed to fool people. So ideally, we'll get rid of 2, 3 answers and we'll be done. But then if we are left with more than one, we match evidence to the passage. And ultimately, all you want is a choice that makes you say, I can't argue with that. Doesn't have to be perfect. Doesn't have to be like exactly proven, although it often is. It's just, well, yeah, that is true. Right, so in this case, we have a perfect match for choice F. Here are a few examples of reading questions you can expect to see on all 4 passage types. Some of the hardest ones, I think. How is the passage organized? Point of view or narrator is usually easier. Main idea of a passage or of a paragraph. And then vocab and context also comes up on this section as well. One of the 4 passages will always be a comparison. So that's the other thing to note here. Not necessarily more difficult. You should only remember to deal with them separately. So don't read passage A and B. It's tough to stop yourself, but keep only a limited amount in your working memory. Read passage A and then do those first 3 or 4 questions. Then read passage B and do the questions that relate to that. And then finally do the comparison questions at the end. Some people like skipping those last few comparison questions because they're harder and time consuming. So that could be a good thing to do. My last tips on reading would be make sure you're using your pencil. So we didn't talk too much about it, but underlining, circling, starring main ideas. The biggest thing is taking simple notes, right? So if you can paraphrase as you read and put little notes in the margin, it can actually speed you up, especially on the questions. Remember that you do not have to go in order. So you don't have to go literature, social science, humanities, natural. You can skip around based on your strengths. And within those passages, you can skip questions. 1 or 2 per passage might be smart to preserve time, confidence, and the, of course, all important momentum. We looked at elimination. So find words that are in there that are wrong. So that'd be like all, never, always, right? Those are really strong words, very sweeping, like really never. So if that's an answer choice, you better make sure you can prove it. And ultimately, what we're looking for is small, unassuming sparrow answers. So something like, this may have a potential effect in the future. How to argue with that? How do you argue against that? Versus a peacock, which is the specific impact this will have is blank in this year. And unless there's evidence for it, that's usually too specific, too flashy. We don't like that for reading. We want vague, nothing answers because we can't argue with those. That's why the elimination process is so effective. And doing well on time, still got 20 minutes. So I think this will take us probably 10-ish. Let's talk science and then timeline. The science section, first thing to know is it is not really science. It is about interpreting graphs. And 5 of the 6 passages will just be all about moving from questions to graphs. 40 questions, 35 minutes means, again, we only get like 52 seconds per question. And so it's hard. You can't take more than a couple minutes per question. You got to move on. But again, it's not real science. There's very limited outside knowledge required. It's just like simple stuff. If you know, the biggest outside knowledge I've seen is like knowing that pH of 7 is neutral, which we may have forgotten. Adding a proton increases the atomic number and changes something to a different element. Even if you've forgotten that stuff, you can usually get there by eliminating nonsensical or non-scientific answers. So in the, I guess, quest to demystify, the biggest rule is don't get bogged down, don't get into the science. If you see like C, just say C, don't say carbon. If you see Fe, just say Fe, don't say iron. Don't translate into science. If you see MMHG, don't say like partial pressure of mercury, just say, I don't know what that is, it doesn't matter. Most of the information is unneeded. We're going to look at questions and answers and match words in the questions and answers to the graphs, right? Most questions on the science section will be done that way, and you don't need any outside knowledge or the passage at all. So this would be a study, and it'd be in the midst of a couple other probably studies and experiment and another table or graph. One thing we can do is draw on the tables, so don't hesitate to draw on your test booklet. Drawing arrows towards bigger numbers can indicate relationships. So like here, what I noticed is as water content increased, clay increased, and so did silt. But as water content increased, there was less sand. Those had an inverse relationship. So if they ask me now about relationships, I've got it built in. I don't need to think hard or dive back into the table. So arrows towards big numbers, that can be helpful. Oops, here's another example. So again, just a table where I don't know exactly what the context is, but we don't need to know. I just know that whatever cosmic ray flux particles are, as they go up, it looks like the percentage low cloud cover also goes up. So there's a direct relationship, and I can answer questions accordingly. Again, a lot of this, here's what questions you could see, but a lot of it's just matching. So what trends do we see? Is there a pattern to expand? Sometimes it's just finding a point or comparing 2 points. And then the harder questions would be like process. What is the most likely reason they did this? How are the experiments different? So then we dive back into experiment 2, which will often tell you the scientists repeated the process from experiment 1, except, and that'll be your answer. Here's an example question for us to look at. And for the person who asked how you get extended time on the ACT, it's a process. Usually you should go through a college counselor. It's very difficult these days to get extended time accommodations on the ACT and SAT if you don't have accommodations in school. But if you do have an IEP or 504 plan or time and a half extended time in school, it's very, very likely that you will get the accommodations on the ACT. And then the ACT is unlike the SAT in that I believe you have to, make sure I'm right. Yeah, I believe you have to apply for each separate test. You have to apply. So once you're approved for extended time, you're probably golden, but you do have to do it separately. So if you register for the July and the September ACT, you have to apply for extended time for each. Whereas SAT, once you're granted extended time, you've kind of got it in perpetuity. And there's an application on the ACT website, but I would definitely talk to the college counselor and make sure that you got help with that, because it really revolves around past accommodations for students. For this particular question, we're just underlining what we're looking for, which in this case is luminosity of a star in galaxy B, and when would that be closest to twice luminosity of a star in galaxy B with a surface temperature of 3000. So that's right there. When would it be twice that? Well, I'll just draw a line out here. And I mean, that looks to me like between 3200 and 3400. So we'd pick G. There shouldn't be any wiggle room. If you feel like you're too close between these answers, look again. And if you struggle like me to draw a straight line without digital technology, you can use your Scantron sheet. So like literally the answer sheet as a straight edge, kind of an old school thing, but you could do that if you need a straight line, right? So you just hold that Scantron sheet up. Here's one more science practice question. This is testing relationships, and it's a pretty easy question. Y-axis is size, x-axis is temperature. The question is, as the temperature goes up, the size does what? And even though it's not a constant rate, it never goes down and it never goes flat. Our answer here is B. Simple as it increases only, it's a direct relationship. And I promise certain questions are this easy. It's just hard to identify them in the midst of a bunch of other sciencey stuff. Last little tips and tricks on science. There is one of the 6 passages that will be a dueling scientist passage. What that means is it probably won't have graphs. It'll have opinion 1, 2, 3, and maybe 4. Sometimes it's scientist, sometimes it's student one, student two. When you see that, you just have to identify it as different. It is not a matching game. It is not one where you should skip the passages and go straight to questions and match back and forth. Instead, you should read the passages for dueling scientists. So some people like to do that one first or last, right? If you feel like, man, I'm coming off reading, that's my strength. I want to do this reading science passage first. Good. A lot of people don't like the reading. They're burned out. They want to do some matching and they'll save dueling scientists for last. And hey, God forbid we run out of time, at least I'm guessing on the passage I liked the least. And again, the other passages, actively read the question and the choices. So always use those answer choices. Then match that back to the graphs. And if you don't have a match, use the passage. And then and only then, if there's still no match, use common sense, think like a scientist. But even then, don't work too hard. We're not rocket scientists, we're fifth grade scientists. Just had a question about the writing portion, so this is perfect. There's no longer an essay portion for the SAT. The ACT does have an optional writing portion, but I mean, as of last year, here were the schools that required it. So not exactly heavyweights. There are a few competitive schools that recommend it if you do a good job, but honestly, I can't remember the last time I told someone they should take the ACT essay. It was a couple of years ago. I think you're better off just focusing on personal statements, not worrying about ACT essay. So even if you're signed up, I wouldn't worry about it. Let me see what the question was. So the question is, I'm signed up for writing. The question is, knowing that I probably don't have to do it, and I can't email ACT and say, hey, I don't want to take the writing. The question is, can I just leave? The answer is yes. I know that feels scary, but once you're finished with the 4 sections, you can just tell the proctor, I'm not staying for the writing portion. They'll probably be grateful to go home early if no one else is taking it, and it will not impact your score or like the record negatively, I promise. No one from ACT will see, oh, they said they were going to do ACT with writing, but there's no essay. That will not be like a stain on your record. So yeah, you can go and don't worry about that writing portion. Just do those 4 sections and get out. That's fine. You have my blessing. Just a quick few questions that may be preempted. First is, when do we start prepping? So a lot of people here would maybe be sophomores who just graduated. Congratulations, or about to, or just moving on to junior year, I should say. And summer before junior year is fine for high scorers. Fall of junior year is good. Generally, December of junior year is about when I'd see it as the most common time. Other question I get is, what's a good ACT score, which is impossible to answer. A good ACT score is something that makes you competitive for the schools you want to go to. And it depends on where you start, right? And how far we're motivated to go up. When we're applying to schools, this is a very complex question. The question is, should I send all my test results? The answer used to be kind of like yes. The ACT now super scores automatically. What that means is, if you take the test, let's say Saturday, and you get a 23 on English and a 28 on math and a 30 on reading and a 28 on science, you average out, you get your composite, which is probably 26-ish, 27. Then let's say we take it again in July, which is a great test, and English goes way up and math goes up, but reading and science go down, and your score stays around the same. The ACT these days automatically super scores. So what you'll see on your account page and what colleges who super score will see, which is over half, is only the highest section scores from across multiple test sittings. So they'll see the English and math from the July test, and then they'll see the reading and science from June, and no one will be the wiser as to how many times you've taken it. This is one huge reason why you should take the ACT more than once. Right? First is, it takes 3 tests to reach full potential for most people, get the experience in the test center. And then super scoring, I mean, my gosh, you could go down on one section, up on another, and still have a good result. When it comes to applications, it's always a case-by-case thing, but there is a lot of strategic submission now. We have a different presentation on that I often do later in the year. And the answer is, it differs from college to college. If you think that it's going to make you look good, right, and it's going to improve your application, send your scores. If you're like, ooh, this is below the normal range for this school and incoming freshman, and I don't think it helps, my GPA is strong, I've got a good personal statement, maybe you don't send this course. And that's very dependent on the student and the school. So here's an example. So let's look at the ACT part. So if I'm at a 23, it looks like I'm right in the range of 25th to 75th percentile of students admitted. That's pretty easily Googleable, although the data are dated in that a lot of times if you look at the school now, you'll see data from like 4-ish years ago, pre-pandemic. But here, if I had a 23 and that's right in the range, I would submit this ACT score. I don't think it's going to hurt me. I think it'll probably help. If I had a 20, I probably wouldn't submit it. Kennesaw State, I think at least was test optional. So maybe I would decide, no, that won't help me. Right, if I'm on the higher range, of course, I'll submit. And then there's no wrong time to test. So just noting, most people should plan on 2 or 3. It, first off, takes, I think, a little bit of pressure off. If you think I'm going to take June, it's one and done, it's got to be it, that's way too much pressure. That's not going to work out most times. But you could do a bunch junior year, you could space it out. Especially, I think the big thing would be decide on which tests, and then like ACT versus SAT, and then identify some test dates you'll register for and target. And then no college prefers SAT over ACT. That's another common question. So they're all going to look at that equally. You just have to look at which one of yours is stronger. So there's concordance tables. You can go to like naviance.org, I think it is. And you can see what does my SAT score translate to, or what does my ACT score translate to. But there's not any school that says we'd rather have an ACT or we'd rather have an SAT. My final words, which I always give my students, is this is not a test of intelligence. There are arguably 8 types of intelligence, and I'd say maybe 2 of them are tested on ACT, which is like verbal and logical. But it's not testing, your intrapersonal or interpersonal or emotional intelligence or naturalistic or any of these things that make us us. So test scores don't define you, especially in this test optional world. It's really just running into the right test on the right day. So all you can do is get rest, don't get sick these next 2 days, and do the best you can, right? That's all anyone can hope for. Then scores come back and you calibrate and take it again if you feel like that's the right move. Again, these are our 3 cornerstones. Feel free to call this number and we can make a custom recommendation for you or your student. We're going to launch a quiz in the chat. And I also want to make sure that people know that June is our big promo. And by quiz, I mean poll. I don't know why I say quiz every time. Sounds much more intimidating than just a poll. And from now till June 30th, we've got our big summer sale. You can get up to 6 hours of free tutoring if you purchase a 30-hour package. I think the most common would be 20 hours, which you get 4 free hours of tutoring, which is considerable value. We run a few promos each year, but this is the big one. Again, you see that number below, and applerouth.com/summer is the link, but I want to open it up for questions. And you'll see on the last slide the email that you can also reach out to. And if you feel like you don't have questions and you're satisfied, you've got 6 minutes, feel free to call it a night, and thank you for joining. All right, got a couple of good questions already, so let me address these. So first one is, can schools see when a test is super scored versus not? The answer is no. If a college super scores the ACT, in other words, that's their policy in their testing admissions policy, they will only see the super score, and they will not know that you took it 5 or 10 or 2 or 1 time. So the answer is no. A school will not see when a test is super scored versus not super scored. If a college doesn't have that policy, they have what's called score choice, where you just have to submit all your scores, then it's a different story and they'll see all those tests. That's more and more rare. So generally for ACT, your super score is your score, and it's just all they'll see is the highest scores from every sitting, not how many times you took it. There's not any real downside to taking ACT like 5 or 6 times. It's just most people have diminishing returns after like 3 times. Next question is what practice I recommend for boosting scores a lot, right? So this is a rising junior, but want to increase the score a lot. It's not a test of intelligence. It is a test of effort. So I think you got to figure out first, is ACT or SAT the correct test for you? You'll have to consider, since you're a rising junior, that the SAT is switching to digital in March of next year. Khan Academy is good for SAT. Applerouth honestly has I'm not biased, but the best online program. So if you're just self-studying, there's a very reasonably priced online program that they put a ton of time into, and it's excellent. Our books are really good. We've got Applerouth Guide for ACT and SAT. I do private tutoring, all day, every day. That's, of course, a really effective method. But I would go practice tests and make sure that you learn every single question you missed, that you can fix it. And then hone in on the question types and concepts that you're not great at. So figure out where your weaknesses are and then just start practicing. The more the better, right? There's lots of good practice out there when it comes to official practice tests and other resources. Next question is, I'm a 2023 grad. Plan did not go this way and taking it in August. Is that still okay? Yeah, like again, everyone's different. And like, wait, worst case, maybe we delay a year. And I wish I'd taken a gap year, or maybe even a semester, right? So yes, that's totally okay. The next ACT after July is the one in September, but I might plan on taking it twice, right? Give yourself a little bit of room to breathe. Don't say, I've got to take this July test and it's got to be one and done. But no, it's totally okay. Not everyone follows the same timeline. And just because a lot of people start junior year does not mean that it's too late by any means. You're probably more prepared than most because now you've finished all the math you need to. And yeah, you'll be fine, I think. A couple more questions here. One is, do I recommend students prepare differently if they're doing computer-based ACT? Yeah. Google computer-based ACT. There's a free practice test, and it will show you the timing, it'll show you the platform, and it'll show you the tools you can use. So the biggest difference is on reading, it's on screen, so you can't mark anything up. So I would use the answer eliminator tool, maybe the highlighter tool, and I'd make sure to go onto that website to see how they work. Other than that, the material is the same, so it's not that different. But yeah, that's internationally, everyone's been taking the digital ACT for a couple of years. How do I know when a school allows super scoring? Yeah, it's on the website. If you Google University of Alabama super score policy, it'll tell you. If you Google, Washington University St. Louis super score ACT, it'll tell you. So yeah, very much widely available. All right, last question I see is a very timely one. Rumor or people say that summer before junior year is when you need to put the pedal to the metal with prep. But I said on my slide that people can wait well into their junior or early senior year. And yes, so I stand by that, but it depends on where you're at. If it's a high scoring student and the college counselors are involved and just it's test prep is kind of a thing at the school, then I do think, if it was me or my student or I don't have children, but that's how I try to think of it. I would probably start thinking about this summer before junior year. Most people wait. Most people start December. The only real reason to wait would be if you're behind, if you're behind, but if you haven't taken like Algebra 2 yet as a junior, maybe you're taking it fall semester. And so maybe that Algebra 2 or pre-calc can help with some stuff. But no, I think summer before junior year, especially for high scorers, is probably the correct time. I don't know about pedal to the metal, but I would definitely target a few test dates and start my prep then to calibrate where I need to go. Okay, last question. My recommendation to a rising junior for ACT, SAT. So no, this is not a stupid question. I think the adjustment of SAT to digital in March of 2023 is important. If you are a sophomore and you're going to be a junior, unless you're planning to get your prep totally done by December of this year, the ACT has an edge over the SAT because it's staying the same. It's a paper test in the US. In March of 2023, the SAT is no longer a paper test in the US and changes to digital and is very, very, very different. There will be overlap. You might still do great, but if I was like even between ACT, SAT, I'm picking ACT right now because of all the changes coming. Thank you guys so much for joining. Hope it was helpful. Good luck this weekend and have a great evening.